Looking back, I should have seen the cracks forming long before they turned into a chasm. But love has a way of blinding you, especially when it's wrapped in the comfort of routine and the illusion of stability. Emily and I were supposed to be partners, two people working toward a common goal, building a life together. That was the dream, anyway. The reality, as it turned out, was much messier. Our relationship started like a spark in the middle of a dry field. Fast, consuming, and impossible to ignore. Emily was everything I wasn't. Where I was analytical and deliberate, she was impulsive and charismatic. She had a way of lighting up a room, of making people feel like they were the center of her world. I'll admit, I fell hard for that. For years, we worked well together. I admired her drive, her ambition, her ability to turn every situation into an opportunity. And she, in turn, supported my entrepreneurial dreams, even when they seemed like long shots. But then, my business started to falter. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow erosion. Deals that once came easily began to dry up, partnerships fell apart, and the economic downturn hit harder than I expected. I poured everything I had into trying to salvage my company, my time, my energy, my savings. And at first, Emily was there for me, offering words of encouragement and reminding me that success wasn't always linear. But as the months turned into years, her patience wore thin. The words of encouragement became fewer, replaced by subtle jabs and pointed questions. "When are you going to catch a break, David?" she'd ask, half joking but with an edge I couldn't ignore. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it, that it was just her way of pushing me to do better. But deep down, I knew better. Emily's career, on the other hand, was thriving. As an event planner, she had built a reputation for herself as someone who could transform even the simplest gathering into an unforgettable experience. Her clientele ranged from corporate executives to socialites, and her calendar was always packed with high-profile events. She was in her element, and I was proud of her, truly. But her success only seemed to highlight my own failures, at least in her eyes. Our evenings, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, became strained. She'd come home late from meetings or events, her energy drained but still buzzing with the glow of accomplishment. I, meanwhile, would be at the kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and emails, trying to make sense of a business that refused to cooperate. "Long day?" I'd ask, trying to keep the conversation light. "You have no idea," she'd reply, pouring herself a glass of wine. And then, almost inevitably, she'd say something like, "Charlotte suggested we try that new restaurant downtown. Maybe we could go next weekend?" Charlotte. That name had become a constant in our lives, though not by my choice. Emily's best friend and the ringleader of her social circle, Charlotte was everything I wasn't. Wealthy, influential, and unapologetically judgmental. She didn't bother hiding her disdain for me, though she cloaked it in politeness when Emily was around. "You're lucky Emily's so understanding," she'd say during dinner parties, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Most women wouldn't be so patient." I'd laugh it off, but inside, her words stung. Emily never defended me, not outright. She'd just smile and change the subject, as if that made it better. The turning point came one night when Emily and I were lying in bed, the space between us feeling more like a canyon than a few inches of mattress. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Do you ever feel like we're not aligned anymore?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, sighing. "It's like we're living two separate lives. You're always buried in work, and I'm always somewhere else." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I was trying, that everything I was doing was for us. But the words wouldn't come, because part of me knew she was right. We were drifting, and neither of us seemed to know how to stop it. "I'll do better," I said finally, though the promise felt hollow even as I said it. She didn't respond, just turned over and turned off the light. That was the moment I realized our marriage wasn't as unshakable as I thought. It wasn't one big thing that broke us. It was 1,000 little things, piling up over time until they became too heavy to carry. And yet, I still believed we could find our way back to each other. What I didn't realize then was that Emily had already started to see things differently. And that difference would lead us to a night I'll never forget. A night that changed everything. Emily's friends had always been a thorn in my side. They weren't bad people, necessarily, but they were the type who thrived on appearances and status. Their lives revolved around designer brands, exclusive invitations, and conversations peppered with thinly veiled insults disguised as compliments. And at the center of it all was Charlotte. Charlotte was Emily's best friend, though best friend might not be the right term. She was more like a queen bee, holding court and dictating the dynamics of their group. She had a way of making everyone around her feel both included and inferior at the same time. She loved Emily, in her own way, but she loved control even more. I tolerated Charlotte for Emily's sake. After all, you can't choose your spouse's friends. But over the years, it became increasingly clear that Charlotte didn't just dislike me. She saw me as an obstacle. I wasn't rich enough, successful enough, or alpha enough for her taste. And she didn't bother hiding it. The first time I met Charlotte, she was hosting a dinner party at her sprawling suburban mansion. Emily had insisted I come along, saying it would be good for us to network. I'd walked into that party feeling like a fish out of water, surrounded by people who seemed to measure worth by the price of their watches. Charlotte greeted us with a dazzling smile and a glass of champagne. "Emily, darling, you look stunning as always. And this must be David, right?" She said my name like it was a question, like she wasn't entirely sure I deserved a spot at her table. "That's right," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for having us." She didn't reply, just gave me a once-over before turning back to Emily. "Come, let me introduce you to everyone." From that moment on, I knew where I stood in Charlotte's world, as little more than a footnote in Emily's story. Over time, Charlotte's influence on Emily grew stronger. It wasn't obvious at first, just small changes in the way Emily talked or the things she prioritized. But as my business struggles became more apparent, so did Charlotte's disdain. "I don't know how you do it, Emily," she'd say during one of our dinners. "Balancing your career while supporting someone else's dreams. It must be exhausting." Emily would laugh it off, but she wouldn't defend me, and that silence spoke volumes. Her other friends weren't much better. There was Lauren, who loved to brag about her husband's promotions, and Vanessa, who had a talent for turning every conversation into a subtle critique of someone else's choices. Together, they formed a chorus of judgment, and I was often their favorite topic. I tried to bring it up to Emily once, after a particularly grating dinner party where her friends had spent most of the evening questioning my business decisions. "Do you ever notice how your friends talk about me?" I asked as we drove home. She glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They make these little comments about my work, my plans. It's like they're waiting for me to fail." She sighed, turning her gaze back to the road. "David, they don't mean anything by it. That's just how they are. You're reading too much into it." "Am I?" I countered. "Because it feels pretty deliberate." She didn't answer, and the rest of the ride was silent. As the months went on, I noticed a shift in Emily. She started spending more time with her friends, going to their brunches and weekend getaways. She'd come back from those outings full of stories and laughter, but there was a distance in her eyes when she looked at me. It was like she was slipping into their world and leaving ours behind. And then there were the comments. The little digs that started as jokes, but cut deeper than she probably realized. "Charlotte says you should try consulting," she said one evening as we cooked dinner. "She thinks it might be more stable." I froze, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. "Charlotte thinks," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "She's just trying to help," Emily replied, oblivious to how much those words stung. "She wants to see us succeed." But it didn't feel like help. It felt like judgment. And Emily, whether she meant to or not, was letting it seep into our marriage. The more time Emily spent with her friends, the more I felt like an outsider in my own life. I wasn't just fighting to save my business. I was fighting to hold onto the version of Emily who believed in me, who saw me as her partner, not a project. But with every brunch, every dinner party, and every comment from Charlotte, that version of her felt further and further away. I told myself it was just a phase, that we'd find our way back to each other once things settled down. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel the tension building, like a storm on the horizon. And when it finally hit, it wouldn't just blow over. It would change everything. The invitation to Emily's latest dinner party arrived with the kind of fanfare only she could muster. She'd been planning this event for weeks, throwing herself into every detail with her usual obsessive energy. The guest list was carefully curated, the menu meticulously planned, and the decorations sourced from some high-end boutique I'd never even heard of. It was going to be the event of the season, or so she claimed. For me, it was just another night of enduring veiled insults and forced smiles. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about Emily showing off her hosting skills. It was about her showcasing her world, a world I was increasingly feeling excluded from. "David, you'll be there, right?" Emily asked one evening, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Do I have a choice?" I replied, half joking. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you do. But it would mean a lot to me if you came. People notice when you're not around." People. By people, she meant Charlotte and the rest of her clique. The ones who live to dissect every aspect of our lives, as if we were characters in some drama created for their entertainment. "I'll be there," I said, forcing a smile. "Wouldn't want to disappoint your adoring fans." She laughed, brushing off my sarcasm, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. The night of the party arrived, and our house was transformed into a scene straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Soft lighting, elegant floral arrangements, and the faint hum of classical music created an atmosphere that screamed perfection. Emily flitted around the room, greeting guests and making sure everything was just right. She looked radiant, confident, completely in her element. And yet, as I watched her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong in this version of her life. I lingered near the edge of the room, nursing a glass of wine and avoiding the growing crowd. I spotted Charlotte almost immediately, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a hawk looking for prey. When her eyes landed on me, she smiled. A smile that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "David," she said, gliding over to me. "How wonderful to see you. How's the business?" I could hear the pause, the deliberate hesitation meant to emphasize my struggles. "Still going," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Good for you," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's so important to stay optimistic, isn't it?" Before I could respond, Emily appeared at her side, beaming. "Charlotte, isn't this just perfect?" she said, gesturing around the room. "David even helped with the setup." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. How supportive of him. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to smile. This wasn't the time or place to make a scene. As the evening wore on, the conversation inevitably turned to work. One of Emily's friends, a tech investor named Martin, asked me about my business. It was a simple question, but I could feel the weight of the room shift as everyone turned to listen. "It's been a challenging year," I admitted, choosing my words carefully, "but we're making progress." "Challenging," Charlotte repeated, her tone thoughtful. "That's one way to put it." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to light a fire in my chest, enough to make me want to leave. But I didn't. I stayed, biting my tongue and reminding myself that this wasn't the time to lose control. Then Emily spoke. "Well, David's always been resilient," she said, smiling at me, "even when things don't go as planned." It was meant to sound supportive, I think, but to me, it felt like another jab. Another reminder that my failures were an open secret, one she didn't mind sharing. By the time the party started winding down, I was on edge. I'd spent the entire evening dodging subtle insults and fake smiles, and I was ready for it to be over. But as I stood by the kitchen, refilling my glass, I overheard something that stopped me cold. "I don't know how she does it," Charlotte was saying, her voice low but audible, "living with someone who's so uninspiring." I didn't hear Emily's response. I didn't need to. The laughter that followed said it all. I stayed quiet for the rest of the night, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just about the party. This was about everything. About how Emily had let her friends dictate the narrative of our marriage. About how she'd stopped seeing me as her partner and started seeing me as her project. And for the first time, I realized that staying silent wasn't just hurting me. It was enabling her. It was time to change that. And soon, everyone in that room would see just how wrong they were. The night had taken on a surreal quality, the kind where every laugh, every sideways glance, every whisper seemed amplified. My glass of wine had gone untouched for the past hour, not because I didn't need it, but because I needed to stay sharp. I could feel it brewing. The humiliation, the moment when I'd be dragged into the center of their ridicule. I could almost hear the punchline before it landed. And then, it happened. Emily had gathered everyone in the living room, where the conversation had shifted to careers and ambitions. Martin, the tech investor with a knack for inflating his own ego, was in the middle of recounting his latest success, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and a self-satisfied grin. "Of course," he said, his gaze flicking toward me. "It's all about resilience, right, David? Isn't that what you've been working on?" The room erupted into polite laughter, the kind that isn't loud enough to be outright mocking but stings just the same. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to keep calm. This wasn't new. I'd been the butt of their jokes before. But tonight, it felt different, more personal. Emily chimed in, her voice bright and casual. "Oh, David's definitely resilient. I mean, he has to be, considering how unpredictable entrepreneurship can be." Her words landed like a slap. She wasn't defending me. She was joining them. And the worst part? She was smiling, like it was all just harmless fun. I looked around the room, taking in the amused expressions of her friends, the way Charlotte leaned back in her chair with a smirk, like she'd just orchestrated the perfect scene. And then, as if to twist the knife further, Charlotte spoke up. "Well, Emily, I suppose it's nice that you have something to balance out your success," she said, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "Every star needs a supporting role, after all." The room exploded with laughter, and that was it. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I set my glass down and stood, the sound of the laughter fading as the room grew quiet. All eyes were on me, waiting to see how the uninspiring husband would react. I didn't rush. I took my time, meeting each gaze in turn before finally settling on Emily. "Balance," I said, my voice calm but steady. "That's an interesting choice of words, Charlotte, because from where I'm standing, this doesn't feel very balanced at all." Emily's smile faltered, and Charlotte's smirk turned into a look of mild surprise. I continued, addressing the room. "I've sat here tonight and listened to all of you share your stories, your successes, your carefully curated lives. And I've noticed something. None of you are nearly as perfect as you like to pretend." The silence was deafening. Martin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Lauren, the real estate agent with a reputation for embellishing, suddenly found her wine glass very interesting. "You see, I've learned something over the past few years," I said, my gaze shifting to Emily. "Failure isn't just about losing. It's about learning, growing. And while I've been doing that, some of you have been so busy tearing others down that you haven't noticed your own cracks showing." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "Take you, for example, Charlotte," I said, my tone sharp but measured. "You love pointing out other people's flaws, but how many times have you been divorced now? 3? 4? And yet, you're the expert on relationships." The color drained from her face, and I turned back to Emily. "And you, Emily," I said, my voice softening just enough to make her flinch. "I've supported you through everything, your career, your dreams, your ambitions, and I never once asked for anything in return. But tonight, you've shown me exactly where I stand in your life. And it's not beside you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might say something. But I wasn't finished. "I've let you and your friends treat me like I'm less than, like I'm a failure. But the truth is, I've been more of a partner to you than you've been to me. And that changes now." I picked up my glass, took a deliberate sip, and set it back down. The room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their judgment replaced by something else, something closer to respect, or maybe fear. "I think I've said enough for one night," I said, turning toward the door. "Enjoy the rest of your party." And with that, I walked out, leaving them all to sit in the silence I'd created. For the first time in years, I felt free. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound oddly satisfying as I left the suffocating atmosphere of Emily's party behind. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from nerves. It was from something else. Something new. I wasn't scared, I wasn't broken, and I wasn't defeated. I was done. Done playing the role they'd cast me in. Done standing by while Emily and her friends turned my life into their punchline. But as much as leaving that room felt like a victory, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets of the city lit up by the cold glow of streetlights. My mind raced as I replayed the night over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every smirk. Emily's laughter echoed in my head, sharp and cutting, but it no longer made me feel small. It made me angry. How had it come to this? How had the woman who once believed in me turned into someone who would mock me so publicly? And how had I let it happen? I parked by the waterfront, staring out at the dark expanse of water as the waves lapped against the shore. For the first time in months, maybe years, I allowed myself to feel everything. Anger, sadness, disappointment, betrayal. And underneath it all, a simmering determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about taking back control of my life. The next morning, I woke up in the spare room at my best friend Liam's house. When I'd called him the night before, he didn't ask questions, just told me to come over. That's the kind of friend Liam was, dependable, loyal, and brutally honest when I needed him to be. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Or do I have to guess? He asked over coffee, his tone light but his eyes serious. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Emily and her friends happened. Again. Let me guess, he said, leaning back in his chair. Charlotte was there? Of course, I replied. She led the charge, but Emily didn't exactly hold back. It was like they were competing to see who could humiliate me the most. Liam frowned, his jaw tightening. And you just took it? No, I said, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Not this time. I told him about how I'd stood up to them, how I'd called them out for their hypocrisy and walked out before they could recover. Liam listened intently, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to pride. Good, he said when I finished. It's about time you reminded them who you are. Over the next few days, I stayed with Liam, giving myself the space I needed to think. Emily called and texted, but I ignored her. I wasn't ready to talk, not until I figured out what I wanted to say. And honestly, I wasn't sure I even wanted to have that conversation. Instead, I focused on myself. I went for long runs, letting the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement drown out the noise in my head. I dusted off an old notebook and started sketching out ideas for a new business venture. Something bold, something entirely my own. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. But Emily wasn't going to let me go so easily. On the fourth day, she showed up at Liam's house unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, looking more vulnerable than I'd seen her in a long time. David, she said, her voice soft. Can we talk? I hesitated, torn between the part of me that still loved her and the part of me that couldn't forget what she'd done. Finally, I stepped aside, letting her in. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. She fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for the right words. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice breaking. For what I said, for what I did, for everything. I didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. Why now? I asked eventually. Why apologize now, after everything? She looked down, her expression filled with guilt. Because I realized I was wrong. About you, about us, about everything. And because I'm scared of losing you. Her words hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. Emily, I said, my tone calm but firm. It's going to take more than an apology to fix this. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I didn't know if I believed her, but for the first time, it felt like she was really listening. And that was a start. But it wasn't enough, not yet. That night, as I lay in the dark, I thought about what came next. I wasn't ready to make any decisions, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going back to the way things were. I had found my voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away again. Not Emily, not Charlotte, not anyone. I knew the fallout from my walkout would be messy, but I didn't expect it to ripple through our social circle so quickly. Emily's friends were like a tightly woven net, one that seemed impossible to escape even when you wanted to. In the days following the party, the phone calls started coming in, not to me, of course, but to Emily. And with each call, I could feel the tension growing. "Charlotte says you embarrassed me," Emily blurted out during our first real conversation since the party. Her tone was defensive, but there was something else beneath it, something closer to fear. "Embarrassed you?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "Is that what this is about? Protecting your image?" She crossed her arms, pacing the living room. "You made a scene, David. You walked out and left me to deal with everyone's questions. Do you have any idea how that made me look?" "I don't care how it made you look," I said evenly. "I care about how you made me feel." "Do you have any idea how it felt to be mocked in front of a room full of people, including my own wife?" Her face softened, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she sighed and shook her head. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Charlotte and the others, they didn't mean anything by it. It's just how they are." "No, Emily," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It's how you've let them be, and I'm done putting up with it." That conversation set the tone for what came next. Emily's friends began to take sides, and it didn't take long for the divide to become painfully clear. Charlotte, unsurprisingly, was the ringleader of those who blamed me for the fallout. "David has always been so sensitive," I overheard her say during one of her phone calls with Emily. "He just can't handle strong personalities." Strong personalities. That was Charlotte's way of dismissing her behavior as harmless banter while doubling down on her disdain for me. And Emily, as much as she wanted to stay neutral, found herself caught in the middle. Not everyone was against me, though. Liam, my best friend, was my rock through it all. He wasn't shy about sharing his thoughts either. "Charlotte's toxic," he said bluntly one evening as we sat on his porch. "She's the kind of person who thrives on making other people feel small. And Emily, well, she's been letting it slide for too long." "I know," I said, staring into my glass of whiskey. "But what am I supposed to do? I can't force Emily to see it." "No," he agreed, "but you can decide what you're willing to tolerate. And right now, it sounds like you're tolerating way too much." His words stuck with me, planting a seed of resolve I didn't know I had. Meanwhile, Emily's other friends began to waver. Lauren, who had always been quick to jump on Charlotte's bandwagon, reached out to me one afternoon. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to say, I think Charlotte might have gone too far," she said. "I mean, I didn't realize how uncomfortable it must have been for you." I appreciated her words, but they didn't change much. The damage was already done, and I wasn't about to let a half-hearted apology erase it. As the weeks passed, the tension between Emily and me grew unbearable. She tried to act like everything was fine, throwing herself into her work and her social obligations. But I could see the cracks forming. Her once effortless charm seemed forced, and her laughter lacked its usual warmth. One evening, after another strained dinner, she finally broke the silence. "David, are we even trying anymore?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. I put my fork down and met her gaze. "Are you?" I countered. She looked taken aback, her eyes darting to the side. "Of course I am. But it feels like you've already made up your mind to hate me." "I don't hate you, Emily," I said softly, "but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. You let your friends disrespect me. You joined in. And now you're more concerned about their opinions than fixing what's broken between us." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. For the first time, it felt like she was starting to understand the gravity of what had happened. That night, I slept in the guest room, needing the distance to think. I wasn't sure where we were headed, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let anyone, Emily, Charlotte, or anyone else, dictate my worth. I was done playing the role of the silent husband, and I was just getting started rewriting my story. The fallout from the party hadn't just shaken my confidence in my marriage. It had shaken the foundation of everything I thought I understood about my relationship with Emily. Days turned into weeks, And while Emily and I continued to exist under the same roof, we were living entirely separate lives. Every conversation felt like a chess match, every interaction weighed down by unspoken tension. And in the background, Charlotte continued to fan the flames. Emily's friends, led by Charlotte, wasted no time turning the situation into their latest topic of gossip. I could feel their eyes on me during social events, their whispers just loud enough to be heard but not confronted. It was Charlotte who took the lead, as always. "David's clearly going through something," she said at one gathering, her voice dripping with faux concern. "It's a shame he couldn't handle the pressure. Poor Emily deserves so much better." I wasn't there to hear it firsthand, but the words reached me nonetheless. Mutual friends, some of whom had started to question Charlotte's influence, passed along the gossip. It didn't surprise me, but it didn't hurt any less. I knew Charlotte wanted to isolate me, to paint me as the unreasonable one, and for a while, it felt like she was succeeding. One evening, Emily and I sat across from each other in silence, the only sound the clinking of silverware against plates. I decided to break it. "So, is this how it's going to be?" I asked, setting my fork down. She glanced up at me, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing to the space between us. "The silence. The distance. Are we just going to pretend nothing happened?" Her lips tightened, and she looked away. "I don't know what you want me to say, David. You embarrassed me at that party. You walked out and left me to deal with the aftermath." "I embarrassed you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Emily, your friends humiliated me in front of everyone, and you laughed. Do you even understand how that felt?" She didn't answer, and the silence stretched between us like a chasm. The turning point came a few days later when Liam, my best friend, convinced me to join him for a drink at a local bar. I needed the distraction, and Liam, as always, didn't hold back. "You know what your problem is?" he said, nursing his beer. "Enlighten me," I replied dryly. "You've spent years letting Emily and her friends walk all over you," he said. "And now that you've finally stood up for yourself, they don't know how to handle it." "It's not just them," I said, sighing. "It's Emily. She's changed, Liam. Or maybe I've changed. Either way, it's like we're not even speaking the same language anymore." He nodded, his expression serious. "Then maybe it's time to stop waiting for her to catch up. Focus on yourself for once. Show them all what you're really made of." Liam's words stuck with me. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Charlotte or anyone else define me. I wasn't going to let Emily's silence keep me in limbo. It was time to take control of my own narrative. I threw myself into my work, reaching out to old contacts and exploring new opportunities. I started hitting the gym, not just to burn off the frustration, but to remind myself of my own strength. And slowly, I began to feel like myself again. Meanwhile, Emily seemed to notice the shift. She started watching me more closely, her guarded expressions giving way to something that looked like regret. One evening, as I was leaving for a networking event, she stopped me at the door. "David," she said, her voice hesitant, "you seem different lately." I paused, turning to face her. Maybe because I'm finally putting myself first. She looked like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. "I've got to go," I said, stepping out the door. "Don't wait up." That night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for my marriage, necessarily, but for myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in Emily's shadow. I wasn't letting her friends' opinions dictate my self-worth. I was reclaiming my life, one step at a time. And while I didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain. I wasn't the same man who'd walked out of that party weeks ago. I was stronger, sharper, and ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant leaving Emily and her toxic circle behind for good. The changes in my life were undeniable. I could feel myself gaining momentum, my confidence building, my focus sharpening. I was reconnecting with the version of myself that I had almost forgotten, buried beneath years of trying to meet everyone else's expectations. But as I began to thrive, the tension with Emily only deepened. She was watching me closely, as if trying to decipher who I was becoming. It wasn't long before she finally confronted me. "David, we need to talk," Emily said one evening as I was preparing to head out for another networking event. Her tone was softer than usual, less defensive. It caught me off guard. Talk about what? I asked, slipping on my jacket. Us, she said, gesturing for me to sit down. I feel like you've been distant. I couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. Distant? Emily, I've been trying to reach you for months. It's only now, when I start focusing on myself, that you notice. She flinched, but she didn't back down. That's not fair, David. You walked out on me at the party. You humiliated me in front of everyone. And what about how you humiliated me? I countered, my voice calm but firm. You laughed at me, Emily. You let your friends tear me down, and you joined in. Do you even realize how that felt? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she shook her head. I didn't mean to hurt you. I got caught up in the moment. The moment, I repeated, shaking my head. That's your excuse? The conversation didn't go much further. Emily was defensive, unable to fully own up to her actions, and I wasn't willing to give her an easy way out. I left for the event feeling both angry and relieved. Angry that she still didn't get it, but relieved that I wasn't letting her excuses sway me anymore. Meanwhile, Charlotte hadn't given up her campaign against me. Word of my newfound confidence had reached her, and she was determined to undermine it. Mutual friends began telling me about the things she was saying, comments about how my success was temporary, how I was trying too hard to prove something. Charlotte's threatened, Liam said when I vented to him about it. She doesn't like that you're not playing her game anymore. And she definitely doesn't like that Emily might be waking up to her influence. It was a perspective I hadn't considered, but it made sense. Charlotte thrived on control, and my refusal to stay in line had thrown her off balance. Emily, too, was starting to see Charlotte in a different light. During one of their lunches, Charlotte had made a snide remark about my recent efforts to rebuild my career. David's acting like he has something to prove, Charlotte had said. It's almost desperate, don't you think? But instead of laughing along, Emily had pushed back. He's working hard, she'd said. And honestly, I admire that. It was a small moment, but it signaled a shift. For the first time in years, Emily was starting to question Charlotte's influence. And while I didn't know if it would lead to real change, it was enough to make me pause. A week later, Emily approached me again, this time with a different energy. She seemed nervous, almost vulnerable. David, she began, sitting across from me at the dining table. I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about everything, and I realize I haven't been fair to you. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Go on. She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Charlotte, she's not a good influence. I see that now. I let her opinions shape how I treated you, and that wasn't right. You didn't deserve that. Her words caught me off guard. For the first time, it felt like she was truly owning her actions. But I wasn't ready to let my guard down just yet. So, what does that mean for us? I asked. I want to fix this, she said, her voice trembling. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to try, if you are. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. But I knew better than to make any promises. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and I wasn't going to compromise the progress I'd made just to smooth things over. We'll see, I said finally, my tone cautious but not unkind. Actions speak louder than words, Emily. If you want to fix this, show me. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't the resolution she'd hoped for, but it was all I could offer. For now, that would have to be enough. The days following Emily's confession were like walking through uncharted territory. On one hand, I could see that she was trying. Her words were softer, her actions more deliberate, and her time with Charlotte noticeably reduced. But on the other hand, the scars from months, maybe even years, of emotional strain didn't heal overnight. I wasn't sure if I could trust her transformation, or if it was simply another phase. Meanwhile, I kept moving forward. I had learned not to make her the center of my universe anymore. My focus was on myself, my goals, and the future I wanted to create. But Emily's efforts couldn't go unnoticed, even if I wasn't ready to give her everything back just yet. One evening, after work, she surprised me by cooking dinner. It was a rare gesture, considering how busy she usually was, and I couldn't help but be intrigued. The dining table was set with candles, and she'd made my favorite meal, steak and roasted vegetables. "Wow," I said, sitting down. "What's the occasion?" She gave me a small smile, her cheeks slightly flushed. "No occasion. I just wanted to do something for you." I nodded, though I didn't let my guard down completely. We ate in relative silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence we'd grown accustomed to. It felt tentative, like we were both testing the waters. After dinner, as we sipped wine on the couch, she finally spoke. "David, I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I want you to know that I'm serious about making things right." I met her gaze, searching for any sign of insincerity. "Why now, Emily? What changed?" She sighed, looking down at her hands. "I think I let Charlotte and the others cloud my judgment. I was so caught up in their world, their approval, that I lost sight of what really mattered. And when you walked out of that party, it hit me, I could lose you." Her words were genuine, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "You didn't just lose sight, Emily. You hurt me. Publicly. Repeatedly. And now you expect me to just forget that?" "No," she said quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't expect that. I want a chance to prove to you that I can do better. That I can be the woman you fell in love with." Her vulnerability was palpable, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the Emily I had married. The one who had supported me in my dreams, who had been my partner in everything. But was that enough? While Emily worked to repair our relationship, I continued to build myself up. My business, which had been struggling for so long, was finally gaining traction. I had secured a new client, one with the potential to open doors I hadn't even considered before. For the first time in years, I felt truly proud of my accomplishments, and I wasn't going to let anyone diminish that. But as my professional life flourished, my personal life remained in limbo. Emily's efforts didn't go unnoticed, but they also didn't erase the hurt. She stopped spending time with Charlotte, choosing instead to focus on reconnecting with me. She attended therapy, both individually and with me, a step I never thought she'd take. It was a start, but trust is fragile, and hers had been broken. The real test came during a dinner party we attended together. It wasn't one of Charlotte's gatherings. Emily had stopped going to those entirely, but a smaller, more intimate event hosted by mutual friends. I was hesitant to go, but Emily insisted it would be different, and it was. For the first time, I saw her truly stand by me. When someone made a passing comment about my past business struggles, Emily didn't laugh or brush it off. She defended me, explaining how hard I'd worked and how far I'd come. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me pause. Later that night, as we drove home, she reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "I don't think I've said that enough." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't respond right away. Instead, I gave her hand a small squeeze, letting her know that while I wasn't fully there yet, I saw her effort. And for now, that was enough. The finality of everything hit me one quiet evening as I sat alone in my home office. It wasn't the anger or the betrayal that lingered. It was the clarity. For months, I had been caught in a storm, questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my self-worth, and my future. But now, as I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized I was no longer that man standing silent in the corner while the world mocked him. I had grown. I had found my voice. Emily's efforts to repair our marriage hadn't gone unnoticed. She had stepped away from her toxic friends, invested time in therapy, and made genuine attempts to rebuild our trust. But as much as I could appreciate her growth, I knew deep down that something had shifted irrevocably within me. What we had before wasn't coming back, not because I didn't care about her, but because I'd learned to care about myself more. One evening, she asked me the question I'd been dreading. "David," she said softly, sitting across from me at the dining table, "do you think we'll ever be the same again?" I looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, and I took a deep breath. "No," I said honestly, "I don't think we will. But that's not necessarily a bad thing." Her face fell, but she nodded. her fingers nervously twisting a napkin. I just want to know if there's still a chance for us. I paused, considering my words carefully. Emily, I think there's always a chance for something new, but it's going to take time. And even then, I don't know if it will look like what we had before. I don't want to make promises I can't keep. She nodded again, tears slipping down her cheeks. I understand. I want you to know I'm not giving up. In the weeks that followed, I focused on continuing to rebuild my life. My business flourished as new opportunities came pouring in, each one a reminder of what I was capable of when I put my mind to it. I reconnected with old friends, people who reminded me of who I was before I got lost in the shadow of Emily's world. And then, one evening, I met someone new. It wasn't planned or expected, it just happened. Her name was Claire, and she was smart, grounded, and refreshingly honest. We met at a small business seminar, and our conversation was easy, flowing naturally in a way I hadn't experienced in years. There was no pressure, no judgment, just mutual respect and curiosity. As I walked home that night, I realized I wasn't looking for a replacement for Emily or trying to fill some void. I was simply open to the possibility of something different, something healthier, and that was enough. Looking back on everything, I could see how far I'd come. The man who had once been mocked and belittled was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to stand tall even when the world tried to tear him down. Emily had played a role in that transformation, but her chapter in my life was closing. As I stood in the quiet of my home, I smiled to myself. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to embrace it, on my own terms.